Hi, I'm Monica Hirst. I'm an engineering lead at Society of Grownups, and I'm here today to talk about deploying your apps using AWS CodeDeploy. Now, because this is a tool offered by AWS, it does assume that you are using AWS, or at least considering using it. Now, all of my slides, as well as a sample app that's implementing a lot of the content I'll be talking about today, can be found in my GitHub repository, which I'll be sharing at the end of the presentation. All right, you have a Phoenix app. It works. Congrats. The hardest part is over. No, really, I promise you, it is. I'm sure at this point, though, you're wondering, how do I actually deploy this thing? So that's where AWS comes in. So CodeDeploy is a tool offered by Amazon that came out in November of last year. We've been using it for about 4 months at Society Grownups with great success. CodeDeploy is flexible, so it requires the same amount of steps to deploy your application, regardless of whether you got one EC2 instance or you got hundreds of instances behind a load balancer in an auto-scaling group. So why should you use CodeDeploy? It makes deployment accessible. So all of our developers at Society Grownups can actually deploy their own code to their QA servers without needing to know anything about DevOps. They fill in a simple form that's on the CodeDeploy website, and boom, it's in front of our QA people, which definitely increases or decreases the development cycle. Secondly, I'm sure all of you have lots of different environments you need to support. QA environments, pre-production, staging, production, dev. Like I mentioned earlier, CodeDeploy makes it a same deploy process regardless of how complicated your environment is, meaning that you have no excuse but to make your QA environments as robust as your production environment. If having your QA environments mirror your production environments will obviously save you some errors, catching some errors earlier on in the process. Now, thirdly, it supports continuous deployment. I'm sure you're all familiar with the benefits of continuous integration, but chief among them, of course, is the sooner you get code in front of people, the sooner you can catch bugs. So at Society Grownups, we actually do have continuous integration in our pre-production environment, not production yet. Fourthly, zero downtime deployments. So if you're assuming you're using an auto-scaling group, Amazon provides different deployment strategies that all of which contain safety nets to make sure that your code, regardless of whether or not your deployment was successful, you still have a running application at the end of it. And last but not least, you can diagnose your failures quickly. So in the same console that you deploy your app, it'll take you to a place where you can monitor the deploy progress. And if there happens to be an error, it will jump right to, it'll tell you which deploy script that happened in, and even highlight the error message for you, which saves you from having to go in and sift through deployment logs, which of course becomes more difficult as you've got lots of machines to try to figure out where the error happened. So for most of my presentation, I'm actually going to take you through what it takes to actually set up your application using CodeDeploy. There are 4 high-level steps in doing this. The first one is to create your EC2 instance. This is where your code will be running. The next step is to create an application configuration in CodeDeploy. And this basically just tells CodeDeploy where are you deploying your code. The third step is to add the required deploy scripts to your repository. And then everything in that step will be checked into your source code. And then the last step, it would be to actually deploy your application. Now, to start off, to launch an EC2 instance, there are a couple of ways of going about this. I'll be going through both of them. So the simple way is just to launch a single instance. This would be good if you're just trying to test this out and play around with it a little bit. But most of you probably really want to see how to set up this for auto-scaling groups. Now, it's actually pretty simple to set up an auto-scaling group. It's only basically one more step than creating an EC2 instance. So to create an EC2 instance, all you need a name tag for the instance, and you'll refer to this later when you're setting up your application. You'll need what's called an instance profile in IAM, IAM being Amazon's user permission system. And this instance profile allows your EC2 instance to read from S3 storage. And then the last thing you need is to have the AWS CLI in all of these machines. If you use Amazon Linux for your EC2 instance, then this comes by default. But if you have a different OS that you use, then it's just a little bit of extra configuration. Now, to create a launch config for your EC2, it's basically the same thing as launching an EC2 instance, because it's just telling Amazon what those EC2 instances need in the group. So you need the same things. You need a name for your configuration. You need an instance profile that allows S3 access, same as before. And you need the AWS CLI installed, with the same caveat about Amazon Linux. Now, once you have a launch config in place, then the additional step that's required is just go into the auto-scaling group, select that launch configuration, and you can basically keep everything else as defaults for the sake of trying it out. So once you have a machine to deploy your code to, you can now set up your application in CodeDeploy. To do that, you need a name for your application. You need the EC2 instance name that you created earlier. Alternately, you need the auto-scaling group name that you created earlier. And you need another system role in IAM, again being Amazon's user permission system. This service role needs to be able to perform code deploy actions. And Amazon has template policies for all of these when you need to go and set up these system users. Now, once you have your application defined in CodeDeploy, you need to add the required steps, deploy scripts to your source code. Now, the most important one of these will be the appspec.yaml. And this actually guides CodeDeploy through the rest of the deploy process. So what I have on the screen here is actually a full example of an appspec.yaml. It just tells you where your code is and what are the steps required for your to deploy your application. So in this case, I've got some install scripts as well as deploy start and stop scripts. If you're using a load balancer, you can also add in steps to register and deregister your EC2 instances as part of the process. Now, the install script is probably the most interesting of all of them. This is where you do a lot of Phoenix-specific configuration here. So this is where you set your mix environment. This is where you install your dependencies. This is where you pull in your secrets file from S3 storage. And this is also where you run your migrations, assuming you run your migrations during the deploy, not separate from the deploy. And then the last set of scripts you need are your start and stop scripts. Now, we basically we just use upstart to manage our starting and stopping our apps, so these scripts are literally one line. Now, once you have all of your scripts in place, you can actually deploy your application. Now, this is the screen that you use every time you want to deploy a revision. So what you need to, first to back up a little, there are two ways you can deploy code through CodeDeploy. You can actually pull code directly from GitHub, or you can read from S3 storage. So if you're using GitHub, what you need is the repository that you want to deploy from. You want to connect to GitHub. There's a link right in the window, the page here, that will pop up a modal that will connect your GitHub account to your Amazon account. You need to know the commit ID that you want to deploy, and then you need to, alternately, if you're not using GitHub, you need to let it know the S3 bucket that your executable is in. And then the last thing you need is to define a deployment strategy. Now, the deployment strategy is what I was hinting to when I talked about zero downtime deployments. Amazon offers 3 of them by default. The safest one is the one-by-one configuration, which deploys to each instance in your group one by one and will not move on to the next host until the last one was successful. On the other end of the spectrum, you can deploy everything at once, which is a pretty risky move. But, but if you have lots of hosts behind an autoscaling group, you probably don't want to wait for each one of those to deploy, because your deploy would take forever. Now, Amazon does provide a compromise solution here where half and half, so that way it'll deploy half of your fleet at once, and if that's successful, it'll deploy the other half. So realistically, I'd probably recommend using that over deploying them all at once. Now, with all of that in place, you hit deploy now, and you wait for your code to build. Now, that form was pretty simple, but I'm sure why not make it even easier? So fortunately, CodeDeploy works with a lot of partners to trigger automatic builds. So we at Society Grownups use Travis. You can also use Bamboo if you want. So for each of these continuous integration partners, they'll actually deploy code to a specified branch or to a specified application every time that something gets merged in and passes a build. Alternatively, if you don't use CI, then you can actually have it read from a branch directly. So you can set it up to work with GitHub or Bitbucket to watch certain branches and deploy code as soon as there are any changes. If you're not using either of those, then you can still configure an S3 bucket to watch for changes. So you could have a manual process somewhere in your environment that FTPs an executable to an S3 bucket. And as soon as it sees a new executable there, it'll trigger a deployment. Now, back to the CodeDeploy screen. This is where it takes you once you've hit that deploy button. You can actually watch your build. It'll show you the progress of how many hosts has it deployed to at this point, and it'll turn green when it's successful, hooray, or it'll turn red when it's failed. And if it fails, then a button will pop up that'll take you exactly to where the error occurred, which saves you from having to go through all of those logs. All right, success. You've deployed your first application. That's awesome. Now, I'm sure that the next step is actually you have more environments. So now that you have one environment, you probably need to set up either new QA environments or staging, pre-production, production, et cetera. So with all of those environments, it begs the question, how do I deal with all of the configuration files needed for those different environments? So I'll be going over a little bit of what the hierarchy that we use at Society Grownups. A lot of this Phoenix gives to you out of the box, which is great. So at the top, you've got your config.exs, which is set up by default when you create a Phoenix application. And we use that for app level configuration, not environment specific. So things like feature flags or some parts of your endpoint configuration, maybe third-party service URLs that don't vary by environment. So for us, that could be like Twitter or Instagram feeds that we use on our site. The next level down will be your dev.exs and your prod.exs. Now these are still things that Phoenix gives you by default. And since these are checked into your source code, this contains non-sensitive values that do vary by environment. So this could be things like log levels and third-party service URLs that do vary that do give you a test environment. So in our case, we use Mandrill and Stripe. Now the next level below is new for this setup, and that we actually have QA level configurations. These inherit mostly prod-like values, but we do provide certain overrides because we don't want to be using real Stripe credentials in the QA server. So this contains not only these service URLs that we want to change for QA, but we also want to add in any other internal APIs or obviously the database associated with it that was specific to that QA environment. And then the last but not least will be your most sensitive of configuration, your secrets.exs files. Now, it's while not required, it's recommended that you have these in S3 storage. As I mentioned earlier during the install script, you actually pull this down during the install so that you have it available when you do the deployment. All right, once that's all in place, you're all set to go. So like I said, I have all of my slides and a sample app with some sample deploy scripts at my repository right here, but feel free to reach out to me if there's any issues. Thank you.
Thanks, Monica. Time for a couple of questions. Questions for Monica about AWS.
So I was wondering, in terms of your deployment structure, when you're deploying to your QA and then to production, are you using some sort of flow that checks in and uses the same deploy, or rather the same build, or is it actually rebuilding each time?
So we actually, we are
rebuilding. Can you repeat the question?
Oh, yes. So the question was, for our deploy process, are we actually reusing that build, or are we rebuilding for when we go to production? And we actually do build on both for QA and production, so we build more than once. We do use the specific QA, the tag, the commit ID associated with the tag for our production releases.
Any other questions for Monica? We'll all be around later. Yes.
Does this work flawlessly, or there is any gotcha? People thought there was problems with deployment, so
Yeah, so CodeDeploy is still relatively new. So because we started using it 2 months after it was officially launched, we definitely had a couple of bugs, like AWS bugs that we had to file with them. So there is still the risk that you might run into a couple of those. I think that database migration rollbacks are still going to be are still a little difficult right now. So it's super easy to roll back your application because you can just redeploy using a commit ID of your previous production build. But for database migrations, there's not great options right now. So if you need to roll back data migration, you can either set up that as a separate app in CodeDeploy so that you completely decouple your database migrations from your app deployments. Alternately, the simple way to do it is just to go into one of your production hosts and run the ecto migrate rollback.
Thanks a lot, Monica.
Yeah.